Tonight, we won't trace the battles of kings or list the laws carved into temple walls. Instead, we'll stand beneath the sky as patient as the ocean it leans toward, on islands where genealogy was not something written in ink, but carried in the breath of living people. Here, a name was more than a name. It was a thread of mana stretched through time, binding chiefs to ancestors, ancestors to gods, and every gesture to the weight of its own history. Some say power moved through blood like wind through a conch shell, invisible, but certain, shaping the order of mats in a meeting house, the sharing of food, the marriages that braided families into kingdoms. Even silence could speak rank if you knew how to listen. So lower the lights. Let the hush of the Pacific press so softly against your chest. And if your thoughts begin to drift like canoes slipping out under the stars, that is the night carrying you with it. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next sacred thread of ancestry will be waiting for you there. And so we follow that thread backward, through chants carried by wind and genealogies recited by memory instead of ink. The first names rise like islands through mischiefs who measured their power not only by the land they held, but by the ancestors whose breath still moved in their veins. Step softly here. Each name is both a story and a promise, spoken aloud so that neither time nor tide can wash it away. An old Hawaii eye, a bloodline could act like a shrine that walked, talked, married, and hosted ceremonies. The thread of descent was not only ancestry. It was something with temperature, like a coil warmed in the sun, believed to carry mana. The charged power that made chiefs into chiefs and turned ordinary gestures standing, sitting, eating into statements about the shape of the world. The first small detail is a seating chart that thinks like a theology. A high-ranking woman walks into a hall, and people understand the room has acquired a center. They lower their eyes because they believe looking directly at someone suffused with mana is like staring into noon. Some of this protocol was gathered under words you will see translated as kapu, or, in other glosses, kapua terms that carry both restriction and holiness, like velvet ropes that are also lightning rods. A chiefess's shadow could be kapu. The ground where she sat could hold a charge. Even her hair could ask for respect without speech. The idea is not to frighten anyone. It is to keep the world tidy. In a tidy world, marriages do not only join people. They align currents, the most charged currents, those that run already within the same house. So you find unions between siblings or close relatives at the very top, performed not as transgression but as maintenance, like resetting a carved wooden god so it faces the dawn. The logic goes like this. If power is carried in blood, and blood can be diluted, then an inner circle marriage is the careful hand on the tap. No drama, just strategy. A family tree that declines to branch is not confused. It is intentional. Genealogies were not lists. They were performance pieces with percussion. A chanter could recite lines for hours, a soft drum under the names, while the audience drifted in and out of attention, which is a very good way to learn a dynasty. Names nested like shells. A famous ancestor reappeared as a syllable in a grandchild, a quiet hello across generations. People say the chant was memory work. You can also say it was electrical work. To marry within a high circle was to coil a wire so the current would run hot. Queens and princesses were not passive in this story. A chiefess decided where a mat was placed, who sat on it, and whether an alliance was a meal or a medicine. The modern mind might reach for the word incest with its alarms. The older framework did not use that lamp. It used lamps of a different color, purity of rank, balance of kapu, the belief that mana prefers not to be poured out like water on sand. Dry humor survives here too. Somewhere a scribe noted that the family's houseposts were all cousins to one another, which is a neat way of acknowledging that trees and kin sometimes share habits. The concept of kapua call it kapu if that spelling is friendlier. The idea remains the same, turns daily life into choreography. Eating could be separate by rank, not because company was disliked, but because appetite was understood to be contagious. A woman of extreme rank might dine away from the crowd as if her bowl needed its own orbit. Certain foods were considered so charged that only alii could sensibly manage them. The rest of us would be invited to something gentler. The gentle foods were very good. Taro that reminded you of the river it came from. Fish that behaved like small conversations. The result was a society that read its own body language fluently. When two siblings of great rank married, no one asked for suspense. They asked for correct mats, correct chants, correct offerings to make the union into a hinge that opened the next room in history. There is irony, but it is soft. The most private relationship was also the most public instrument. A marriage could operate like a law that breathed. Now the story slides sideways to the places where people whispered anyway. Every system raises an eyebrow at itself. Court gossip existed because gossip is how humans relax. A couple whose union pulled the ropes very tight might startle even other chiefs in the way a thunderclap startles the weather. Someone sighed that the tree would be happier if it tried one more branch. Someone else said the tree knew its own business. You see quiet rivalries in the placement of mats, in who enters first at a ceremony, in who receives a feather cloak heavy with yellow that took generations to gather. Cloaks were spreadsheets worn as capes. They displayed budgets of labor and affection in dots and bands. A woman wearing one did not have to declare rank. The cloak announced it in bird language. These displays were not only for delight. They created a field in which marriages could be read like maps. If a famously charged woman chose a partner inside the inner circle, it was both a love letter to tradition and a memorandum to the island about who would be hosting fate this season. The most infamous pairs, the ones that travel through books with their own footnotes, were not always infamous then. Perspective is a solvent. What looks scandalous at a distance looked to its participants like fitting a lid to a pot. There were half-sibling unions that aligned two districts like puzzle pieces. There were cousin matches so close that a single grandmother could solve the whole family tree, which is an economical use of grandmothers. There were marriages arranged while the sea reported on weather, and everyone pretended not to count canoe paddles as votes. The political math of these unions is not complicated. Every high house wants continuity with itself and cooperation with neighbors. A chiefess at the center of that wants leverage that travels invisibly like scent. A marriage within the circle perfumes everything quickly. It is not romantic in the modern postcard sense. It is courtship with a ledger. Power before love sounds harsh until you watch the pace at which power strolls. It does not run. It keeps appointments. A royal woman grew up learning which glance in a reception line is policy and which is play. She learned the kindness of calling a rival sister, which was sometimes literally true and always strategically correct. She learned the geography of seating, where her mat might be placed to shade another woman's influence like a tree positioned between sun and garden. When she married inside the circle, people pretended to be surprised in the way people pretend to be surprised by holidays. If she married outside, that was a statement too, like moving a canoe into a new current on purpose. The small absurdity here is that every very large decision is enacted by very ordinary objects. Mats, bowls, garlands, feathers, cups. You could doze off mid-ceremony and wake to find the politics had adjusted while the ocean kept being the ocean. Now we arrive at the drowsiest question: health. Modern readers trained on kaiti charts ask about genetics with their pencils sharpened. The answer requires a hammock, not a ruler. Island populations are small, even when everyone avoids marrying cousins. The risk of repeating certain traits can exist for reasons that have nothing to do with a single decision. Records are uneven. A burial chant might describe someone as delicate because poetry likes delicate people. A missionary's diary might count every cough as proof of a theory. There are hints of infants who did not thrive, but infants in many places did not thrive for many reasons: infection, nutrition, contact with new diseases that arrived with ships and did not bother to learn the language. You will find scholars who point to skeletal studies that suggest health stress. You will find others who warn that the sample sizes are yawns rather than trumpets. The fairest sentence is the softest. Risks existed. Outcomes varied. Causes braided together like a lei where you cannot pull one flower and call it the whole necklace. Myths grew quickly because myths make good pillows. Later storytellers stitched royal marriages into tales big enough to carry criticism and gossip across oceans. A court lady became a symbol. A choice became an emblem. A wedding became an anecdote designed to make a preacher's point on a rainy night. Some legends say the sacred marriages always produced wonder children with double rations of manna, as if rank were a spice spooned once more into the pot. Others say the opposite, that such unions inevitably produce frailty, as if the gods punished enthusiasm for policy. The record, when you find it, muddles both extremes. Some very formidable rulers came from close unions and lived long orchestrated lives. Some did not. The same is true in other families with more generous spacing on their trees. Legend likes clean lines. Reality likes quilt patterns. The humor here is that everyone prefers to inherit a perfect narrative, and everyone ends up inheriting laundry. The scene shifts again to the new voices that did not know how to whisper. Western contact arrived with Bibles, barrels, clocks, and schedules for thunder. Missionaries brought a rule book for marriage that did not contain sections on kapu, kapua, nei api o unions, or the electricity of rank. They did not believe power lived in blood the same way. They believed it lived in vows and law. Chiefs converted, some from conviction, some from the practical observation that ships and muskets were persuasive teachers. The kapu system was broken publicly, which is to say the theater changed dramaturges, and people started sitting and eating differently, which is one way to rename a world. Sibling marriage at the top faded not because desire lessened, but because the platform moved and the floor plans were redrawn. You can think of it as architecture. Families became houses with new blueprints. A queen who would have married her brother a generation before might now marry a man whose power came from a different table entirely. Love may have been invited more freely, but so were courts from abroad with their own kinds of noise. Cultural shifts rarely turn off old lamps all at once. In corners, old ideas stayed lit at dimmer settings. Genealogies did not forget themselves. They simply learned to speak to churches instead of gods carved from wood. Feather cloaks left war canoes and learned to visit glass cases. They still flickered when you walked by, as if the birds remembered their work. Rank learned to wear European jackets without giving up entirely on its own temperature. The discourse about inbreeding a very modern, very sharp word-shaped perceptions of queens and princesses after the fact, like captions written decades later under photographs of people who had not seen the caption writer's handwriting. Outsider narratives liked scandal because scandal is a quick flavor. Insider narratives liked order because order is a slow comfort. The modern listener receives both and is left to stir them together with a spoon-labeled context, which is a tool that works best when you use it until you forget you are holding it. What remains today is a quiet echo in place names and family names, in the way elders talk about the old courts as if there were rooms still available for small visits. School books say the monarchy ended, which is true on paper. Islands say ancestry goes on, which is true in houses. The legacy of inbreeding, if you insist on keeping the phrase, mainly shaped how outsiders spoke about insiders. It became a lens, and lenses are famous for both improving and distorting vision. Meanwhile, the real legacy in kitchens and on porches is that people still like to sit where their grandparents sat and feel the wind do the same trick with the same trees. The political consequences are larger, of course. Titles, retired land, divided laws, moved to different capitals, but the daily memory is gentle. Whose forehead your features resemble, whose laugh you accidentally borrow, which side of the family your hands consult when they cook. A small, amusing detail slips in like a gecko on a wall. The feather cloak we mentioned earlier required tens of thousands of tiny yellow feathers taken from forest birds that were then released so their donation could regrow. A sustainability policy written in bird. That cloak could hang from the shoulders of a woman whose marriage tied 3 districts together with one knot. Outsiders later saw a bright blanket and a puzzling family chart. Insiders saw hummingbirds of law. Another soft oddity. Certain chiefs' houses asked visitors to lie prone as they entered, not as humiliation but as insulation, a way of keeping the sparks from jumping. Western visitors wrote down the rule with exclamation points. Islanders lived it like remembering to knock before you go into a library. When the rule went away, it did not mean the idea of sacredness went away. It learned browsers and bookshelves instead. Even in the most charged unions, you find normal furniture. A comb on a shelf. A bowl that has been repaired with Senate cord at the handle, because items with stories should be encouraged to keep telling them. Women with titles also lost needles and looked for them in rushlight. They also listened to canoes talk to the reef at 3 in the morning and felt exactly the same mixture of worry and calm that people feel now when their phone glows at odd hours. If you reduce them to their marriages, you miss the pleasant detail of how they liked salt on a certain fish, or what song they hummed while bundles were lifted for travel. The point of a sleep story is to let these details arrange themselves like shells on a string until you forget which shell you started with, so we return slowly to the opening thread. A family tree treated as shrine can astonish the modern ear. It can also rock the mind to rest, because it is an old human habit to treat our relatives as if they were weather. Sometimes they bring rain. Sometimes they bring clear days. Sometimes they are entirely predictable until they are not. In Hawaii, I have a habit put on ceremonial clothes and learned to speak in laws and chants. It married close to home to keep the current bright. Later, it dressed differently and learned new vows. The people inside those changes were not metaphors. They were women who navigated rooms, faces, mats, feathers, and the ocean with attention that would exhaust a lesser sort of power. If you're still awake, you can picture a comb house at evening, a lamp that used to be a torch, a chant that has forgotten its audience and continues. Anyway, and a family tree outside that has decided politely to keep growing exactly as much as the wind allows tonight. You might not expect a family archive to hum, but in old Hawaii, a genealogy recited in the right order can make a house sound faintly electric. Names step out, one after another, like careful dancers greeting the floor, and by the time the chanter reaches the line you were waiting for, the room has learned a lesson about rank without anyone raising a voice. I'll keep the pace slow and the corners rounded. If you still awake when we drift past a very quiet rule about which mat a chiefess may sit on while wearing a cloak bright with thousands of borrowed feathers, feel free to subscribe softly as if you were smoothing the kapa blanket of a story that intends to keep going, whether or not you notice every thread. If not, the chant will continue politely in the background. Chants are good at that. The first detail is not a scandal, it is furniture. A housepost carved with a spiral reminds visitors that families also like to be trees. And a tree in this landscape is not only a plant, it is a diagram that can host lightning. Mana is the word people use for that charge, the property that makes rank more than arrangement and turns simple gestures, sitting, standing, eating into small ceremonies. Within that logic, some marriages happen very close to home. A union between siblings of high degree is not presented as a surprise. It is presented as a calibration. If power lives in blood and can be spilled by inattention, then keeping the circle tight is like keeping a lamp trimmed. Outsiders see a family tree that declines to branch. Insiders see a current looped back, so it will glow more evenly. You can hear the difference in the way people speak about mats. Where you sit is not a chair problem. It is a weather problem. The mat a chiefess occupies can make a corner feel like sunrise. And if the person on the neighboring mat is her brother and also her husband, because the circle asks for precision this generation, the room does not gasp. It rearranges its breathing to match the new center. The idea that holds this together is sometimes rendered as capu, sometimes as capua when old spellings wander into new books. But whichever your eye prefers, the heart of it is order tied to holiness. People describe it as restriction, yes, but only the way we call a railing a restriction. The railing keeps us from tumbling into the sea while we enjoy the view. In practice, that meant certain foods belonged to certain people at certain times. A chiefess of extreme rank might eat apart not because she disliked company, but because her bowl had to manage voltage. The ground where she sat could be capu. Her hair could ask for caution. Even her shadow could be treated as a kind of border. This gave marriages a tone we might call architectural. They were built, aligned, and maintained. The partner chosen could be a cousin within a cousin, someone whose name had appeared 3 times already in the chant, and the effect would be less romantic in our sense, and more like fitting the top stone onto a carefully prepared platform. The humor here is small and survivable. The most powerful ritual in the district still required a competent person to check whether the floor was level. The second detail arrives carrying stories with sharp elbows, but we will file them kindly. The pairs remembered as infamous in later writing were often only efficient at the time, like a well-run canoe whose paddlers happened to be family. There are accounts of half-siblings joined so 2 districts would stop testing each other's fences. There are tales of cousins married so closely that one grandmother could hold the entire alliance in her lap, which is convenient for travel. Moments that read as shocking now were sometimes read as sensible then. A visiting chief might raise an eyebrow. A chanter would raise the volume. The exchange of feather cloaks would perform most of the talking. Those cloaks, stitched from tens of thousands of tiny yellow or red feathers plucked sparingly from forest birds and then grown again, were portable spreadsheets of labor and love. They let a woman enter a space and measure it with color. Worn by 2 people of the same inner circle, the message was gentle and decisive. This house intends to keep its weather. If we slow the frame even more, we notice that these decisions were not made in thunder. They were made around bowls, over garlands, near the low talk of the sea. A chiefess learned early which glance counts as policy and which counts as kindness. Both matter, but not in equal portions on every day. She learned to call a rival sister with a tone that could mean 5 different things, 2 of them affectionate and all of them useful. She learned that a mat placed a little to the left could make an old treaty feel like a new one. When she chose a partner inside the circle, it signaled to the island that the vault was being closed for a season so the contents would not evaporate. When she stepped outside for a match, perhaps to someone powerful in a neighboring house, it signaled a different weather front, rain shared between valleys or shade, extended or a breeze that might change how the canoes felt about today's trip. Love existed, obviously. People are not furniture. But love often learned to be polite in the presence of maps. We drift now into the patient room where modern questions live. What of health, asks a reader trained by tidy graphs. What of the risks taught by small populations and repeating cousins? The answer is a long hammock, not a quick chair. The islands were already small genetic neighborhoods, even without sibling unions at the very top. Add in the other realities old infant mortality for many causes. New infections after ships began to anchor with their own weather on board. nutrition that obeyed seasons and surf, and the ledger becomes difficult to read in a single column. There were robust men and women from very close unions whose lives sound like steady drums. There were infants lost in families that married quite wide. Skeletal studies whisper stress. Genealogical songs shout resilience. A fair sentence is the one that yawns and admits complexity. Risk was present, outcomes varied. 'Cause braided with, 'cause the way a lay does when you cannot pull one flower without disturbing the rest. Myth acted as a memory foam under all this. Later writers, hungry for parables, turned royal marriages into emblems that could be carried into debates far from Hawaii. One version says sacred unions made miracle children with extra mana, like adding a spoon of spice at the end for courage. Another version insists the gods punish such focus with frailty, as if power resented neatness. The record that survives chants, letters, court notes, missionary diaries written italic on damp paper politely refuses to be as tidy as either story. Reality loves quilts. Some patches are bright, some are old. The whole keeps people warm. If a chiefess from a very close match grew to rule with calm hands and a measured voice, the myth will wander off in search of drama elsewhere. If she fell ill, the myth will claim it knew all along. Stories are like that. They reward accuracy when it does not interrupt the rhythm. We turn the page to Western contact and the mischief of clocks. The Capu system was publicly broken in a year that can be written neatly on chalkboards, but the emotions took longer to fold into drawers. Missionaries arrived with a marital theology that did not include voltage management by bloodline. They believed in vows as law and law as a map for everyone, high or low, to follow without drifting. Chiefs adopted new patterns for reasons that ranged from faith to arithmetic. A sibling marriage that would have made a priest of the old ways nod now made a pastor frown, and the podium moved. A queen who would have married her brother a generation earlier might now consider a man whose power came from Bibles, ships, and a handwriting that could travel to foreign courts. The sense of dinners changed. The order of seats changed. The way one entered a room and where one paused changed. The feather cloak traveled from war canoe to museum glass and kept its glow, which is the closest thing to fairness objects can offer when people decide to rename their days. Even as laws shifted, old ideas found ways to nap without dying. Genealogies still mattered. They learned to be printed in hymnals' margins. The sense that a person could carry weather into a room did not disappear. It learned to accompany a jacket and a pen. Outsiders used fierce language like INBRED to discuss insiders, sometimes to argue that a kingdom did not deserve to remain a kingdom. Insiders used softer language like proper match to discuss themselves, sometimes to argue that the island still recognized its own reflections. The legacy you can measure in lecture halls is one story. Crowns retired, titles inventoried, constitutions debated. The legacy you can measure in kitchens is another, who an aunt says you look like. How a cousin's laugh belongs unmistakably to the line that used to sit on the left. What song a grandmother hums when she threads a needle and remembers a chant that still hums back. Tiny oddities make this gentler. That feather cloak, to repeat, depended on birds whose feathers were plucked in kindness and returned sustainability woven centuries before we taught the word to carry briefcases. A visitor might be asked to prostrate near a high-ranking woman's mat, not as humiliation but as insulation so the sparks did not hop inconveniently. Western diaries added exclamation points, locals added calm. The restriction on certain foods during certain rituals turns into a modern shrug in restaurants when someone says, "No, thank you, that is for the elders tonight," and the table quietly agrees. Protocols survive like seeds hiding in the seams of a basket. They sprout when the weather is neighborly. When you zoom in further on lives, you step past the labels and into the furniture again. A chiefess who symbolizes an entire policy also misplaces a comb and asks a servant where the good light is for finding it. She also prefers a certain salt on a certain fish in the morning because it invites bravery into the day. She also keeps a bowl repaired with senet cord at the handle, a reminder that objects that have done their best should be encouraged to continue. The marriage that interests a book does not exhaust the person who lived in its rooms. She knows where the breeze comes through the planks in that one corner. She knows which chant calms the baby and which chant calms her. If you reduce her to her partner choice, you will miss the noise Taro makes when it meets a good stone. So we return gently to the operating system of it all. Sacred bloodlines acted less like melodrama and more like maintenance. In the first scene, we watched a house learn where its center was. In the second, we watched pairs everyone else called outrageous act-like hinges. In the third, we let health breathe instead of prove a point. In the fourth, we watched rules change outfits and continuity find a polite new seat. The whole subject is much quieter than its titles, like a drum you hear from far away that turns out, up close, to be somebody's fingers on a table. If you are still awake, you can imagine a calm evening room, the sea sending small notes under the door, a chant testing the rafters for echoes, a mat made ready with a cloak that looks like sunrise after rain, and a family tree outside arguing gently with the wind about how many branches to grow this year. If you are no longer awake, the names will keep lining up correctly anyway. That is what names do when they are recited by people who have practiced staying unhurried for a very long time. You might not expect a family rule about where to sit to decide whom to marry, but in old Hawaii, a map could behave like a compass and a marriage like the needle that studied it. The house had a center you could feel without looking. The center moved with the person who carried the most heat of rank. The quiet voltage people called mana, and the room rearranged itself so that bowls, shadows, and even the doorway learned their manners. I'll go slowly. The subject prefers walking. If you read still awake by the time we reach a very drowsy footnote about feather cloaks and borrowed sunlight, you can subscribe as softly as a hand-smoothing kappa. If you drift off first, the names, the mats, and the weather of rank will keep talking among themselves. They are practiced at continuing without applause. A first small detail, genealogy as furniture. In a hale that hosted alii, a chant wasn't background music. It was the blueprint you could hear. Names stepped forward, one after another, and the house posts seemed to nod because the story kept the roof steady. When rank is a charge carried in blood, a marriage becomes more than fondness. It is maintenance. The closest unions among the highest lines, sometimes half-siblings, sometimes cousins narrow enough to share a grandmother's laugh, were not treated as shock. They were treated as tightening a cord before the canoe goes out. The term many writers choose is kapu, sometimes spelled in older books as kapua. The spelling argues about itself while the idea sits still. Holiness, order, boundaries that make the day behave. Foods belong to certain people at certain hours. Places held a personality for a while after an alii sat there. Even hair required a protocol, which makes sense if you've ever seen what hair does with weather. Within that system, marrying inside the circle wasn't disobedience. It was a way to keep the light from thinning. If power is a drink you pour, the inner circle match simply used a smaller cup and a steadier hand. A gently absurd fact, the most dangerous part of some ceremonies, according to one meticulous visitor, was not the decision itself, but the number of mats to arrange. It turns out fate wrinkles if you set a mat down crooked. A second small picture, a bowl, and a rule about who could share it. High-ranking women were not fragile, they were charged. Eating apart could be insulation, the way you keep two wires from touching so the whole house doesn't hum too loudly. Certain fish were too bright with meaning for ordinary days. Certain cooked things wanted the quiet of a small mat and a window. A chiefess might be carried so her feet did not rob the ground of scents. Outsiders wrote down the customs with exclamation points. Insiders performed them with the softer punctuation of habit. Inside this choreography, you find marriages that act like hinges. When a woman of very high birth chose a partner inside her own small circle, 2 districts could be made to stop quarreling without anyone picking up a paddle. When she chose someone just outside, the island learned to balance a new weight. The cloak she wore, yellow or red spots, collected one tiny feather at a time from birds that were politely released to grow more, made the argument visible. The cloak was a spreadsheet in bird language. If you are still awake, you can picture the little hooks of fiber, thousands of them, carrying arithmetic without numbers. Now the scenes drift, as markets do in the afternoon, towards stories everyone knows and no one quite agrees on. The unions, later called infamous, usually looked efficient in their own daylight. A half-sibling pair closed a circuit between 2 chiefs who otherwise preferred different currents. A pair of cousins so tight that the chant could name their common ancestor in one breath provided continuity that made stewards smile. The humor is domesticated. The most earth-shaking alliance still required someone to remember to bring extra walk-ups. Gossip existed because gossip is how people keep oxygen at a comfortable setting, but it stayed low to the ground. Officials watched the placement of mats with the attention today's readers reserve for headlines. A hand's width left or right could mean a season of truce. The idea that love and policy were enemies did not apply. Love was welcome if it learned to keep the schedule. A chiefess called a rival sister and could mean 5 different things, 2 of them affectionate and all of them useful. She understood that the door where she entered was a sentence, and the pitch of her first greeting was its verb. Health arrives late in the conversation, carrying modern charts like folded fans, and we open them carefully. Small islands were already genetic villages, even before deliberate inner-circle marriages appeared at the top. Shipborne infections later rewrote the ledger more aggressively than any wedding ever did. Notes in missionary hands count coughs as if coughs were votes. Chants remember full-grown lives with a generosity that confuses statisticians. Archaeology whispers about stress in bones and then shrugs because samples are small and time is an imperfect archivist. You will find tales of infants who did not thrive, but infants in many places did not thrive for many reasons: fevers, storms, famine that seldom made the chant, ordinary risk written in every century's handwriting. There are also those chief-born adults whose biographies sound like study drums. Long years of ceremony and sea breezes and careful politics, produced by unions that modern readers prefer to place in italics. The fairest sentence is the one that yawns a little. Risks existed, outcomes varied. Cause braided with, cause the way a lei hides its knots behind flowers. Legends add their own spice. One story insists the sacred matches produce children with double mana, as if rank were a thing you could ladle twice. Another claims the opposite, that the gods punish geometry. Reality, patient as it is, chooses both and neither. Quilts, not equations, keep people warm. The next turn of the paddle sends us toward visitors who arrived with clocks. The public breaking of the Capu system happened on a day with a date, and people love dates because they make time behave on paper. In rooms, change took longer, the way a wave still remembers the moon after the shore believes the tide has turned. Missionaries brought a marriage code that did not understand voltage management by bloodline. They preached vows, and vows did good work. Chiefs watched ships and guns and books and decided in different degrees that new order offered useful weather. Sibling unions at the top dimmed because the stage had been moved and the seating chart rewritten. A queen who would once have tightened the circle might now look to a man, whose power came from letters and laws that traveled by mail. The feather cloaks left water and found glass. The prostration some houses asked of visitors' insulation, not insult, grew rare and then turned into a museum caption. The word INBRED, a very efficient tool for people who wish to measure or diminish a kingdom, became a lens through which later readers examine earlier rooms. Lenses help and distort in the same breath. A kind countermeasure is context. It asks you to listen to a chant before you grade a genealogy. And yet old light does not vanish. It learns new lamps. Genealogies survive by changing stationery. A family that once recited its weather under a thatch roof now writes it into a Bible margin and treats it with the same quiet electricity. The sense that a person can carry the temperature of a room remains, even if the room has chairs with arms and a clock that ticks. In kitchens, the legacy is softer than in courts. Aunties still tell you which jawline came from whose canoe. Uncles decide a laugh belongs to a line that used to sit on the left. Children learn that the word for cousin can be both specific and generous without anyone breaking into a debate. Outsiders continue to quarrel with titles. Insiders keep track of whose hands fold kappa with the old patients. We should also let in a few tiny oddities that make memory smile. Feather cloaks depended on catching living birds, plucking a few feathers, and letting the birds fly sustainability written in wings before they learned to wear a tie. Certain foods, charged with meaning, were reserved for alii, turning a breakfast into a map. Some houses asked people to avert their gaze at particular angles, not because looking was rude, but because attention itself conducts heat. The sky still holds these habits at dusk. If you stand quietly in a place where a high mat used to be, the wind will pass exactly as if it remembers you were supposed to lower your eyes there. That is not mysticism. It is how repetition leaves dents in the air. Specific lives deserve a little room, even in a sleepy survey. A chiefess you might read about as a symbol also misplaced combs and laughed at herself. She preferred a certain salt on a certain fish in the morning and believed it helped the day listen. She knew where the plank near the corner lifted with a sigh in the rainy months, and which chant calmed. Children faster than a cup of awa calm their uncles. She had a bowl with a handle repaired in Senate cord rather than replaced, a domestic decision that says more about continuity than a dozen edicts. If you reduce her to the geometry of a marriage, you miss the way her shadow moved at noon, which is where politics really starts. Some of the best micro-stories are almost pointlessly precise. A steward insisted the bowl for awa must always tilt so the carved ridge faced east. He could not prove why, but the ceremony tasted right when he remembered. A chanter recited the genealogy in a breath pattern that matched the surf, and when he caught a cold, the family waited to announce anything important until he had recovered, as if the island needed to hear the names on the right tide. Someone joked that the tree outside the house was related to the family because it leaned toward the door. And then the joke became tradition, and a great-grandson planted a cutting at his new home because leaning trees make rooms understand their duties. None of this answers a thesis. All of it answers a night. By the time we have wandered through these rooms, the titles that sound like thunder-sacred bloodlines, scandals, consequences, collapse have deflated into something more realistic and more human. Sacredness was a way to keep order in a world that needed steady chairs. Scandals were often just policy written with familial ink. Consequences belonged to many causes at once, as shared as the air over a bay. Collapse was a change in carpenters. What remains is ordinary and therefore durable. People making sense out of power with the tools in their hands mats. Bowls, chants, cloaks, glances, and adjusting when new tools arrived. If you are still awake, you can picture an evening room with a lamp that used to be a torch, a chant that forgot to stop when the audience dozed, a feather cloak that looks like a private sunrise, and a family tree outside negotiating with the wind about how many branches make sense this year. If you have drifted, the genealogies will keep their places, the mats will stay flat, and the sea will count the names again at the door, as it does, without hurry and without asking anyone to take notes. You might not expect a whisper about a seating mat to rearrange a whole island's politics, but in old Hawaii, the place where a woman sat could hum with meaning the way a shell hums with ocean. The hum had a name, Mana, and it moved through families like warm current through a reef. I'll keep this slow and even the way a chant keeps time without deciding anything. If you still awake by the time we pass a very quiet rule about who may share a bowl when feathers are in the room, feel free to subscribe with the same effort it takes to smooth a wrinkle in kapa. If you drift off first, the mats and the feathers and the hum will continue politely without you. They're good at that. Begin with a detail that looks like furniture. In a chiefly house, the posts held up more than a roof. They held up a genealogy you could hear. Names arrived in order, stepping carefully, and each one added a little heat to the place where a chiefess set her mat. Her shadow could be treated as a boundary you did not cross, not because she was fragile, but because her presence conducted something the way a copper pot conducts tea. Within that logic, a marriage could be chosen from very near at hand. A union between close kin, sometimes siblings, sometimes cousins so narrow that a single grandmother could explain the entire alliance, was not presented as a scandal. It was presented as maintenance, like tightening a rope on a canoe before deciding where to paddle. The word often used for the rules holding this together is kapu sometimes, written as kapua in older transcriptions, rules that made holiness practical and daily, like a railing that keeps you safe without telling you where to look. Certain foods preferred certain people, certain bowls preferred certain hands, and certain doorways learned who should enter first. If power lives in blood, and blood behaves like water, then keeping it from dilution was a matter of careful cups. It is mildly funny that fate could wrinkle if a mat was set down an inch crooked, and someone always fussed over corners with the seriousness of a librarian. Listen a little longer, and eating becomes choreography. A woman of very high rank might dine apart, not to be difficult, but to keep the house from buzzing like a poorly wired lantern. Fish with meanings attended the elite and then went back to swimming in stories. Hair had manners because hair remembers wind. Even a chiefess's breath could be treated with respect, which is endearing when you consider how practical breath has to be. Inside that choreography, marriages aligned currents. A sibling union at the very top was like setting two lamps close together, so the center of the room would be bright enough for ceremonies that asked the world to pay attention. People who grew up with these customs did not gape. They adjusted the bowls and confirmed the chant. Outsiders later would bring exclamation points. Insiders used gentle punctuation, mostly commas and pauses long enough to hear the sea. Now the stories tip toward the couples everyone likes to point at. Infamous is a strong word written by later hands that preferred headlines. In their own mournings, many of these pairs were efficient more than dramatic. A half-sibling match put two districts on the same track without speeches. A cousin pair so close that the chant could say their ancestral hinge in one breath gave stewards the comfort of continuity. The feather cloak did most of the talking anyway. A chiefess in a ahu yula wore a spreadsheet made of birds, tens of thousands of tiny yellow or red feathers plucked respectfully so the birds could be released, and groundware brightness a sustainability policy written in wings before the word sustainability got a briefcase. When two people of the inner circle wore that light at once, the room understood the memo without ink. There was gossip because gossip is how humans keep oxygen at friendly levels, but it can blow. What mattered to everyone with a practical job was whether the mats were placed correctly, and whether the bowls faced the right way on days that had names. Power before love sounds blunt until you watch how politely power walks. A chiefess learned which glance is law and which is kindness, a distinction that would make a very good children's book. She knew that calling a rival sister could mean 5 things, 2 of them affectionate and all of them useful. She understood that entering through the left door could unwrinkle a treaty that had slept badly. When she married inside the circle, people did not sigh. They noted that the vault had been closed for a season, so the contents would not evaporate. When she chose a partner just outside, people looked to the horizon to see what kind of weather the canoes would report tomorrow. Love lived here, but it learned to keep the calendar. There is a quiet punchline in the way the largest political decisions still required someone to mind the small tools. A comb laid on a shelf with its teeth pointing outward, a garland, soaking so it would not sulk, a drum warm just enough to remember the rhythm. We can pause to let modern questions arrive with their charts. Did these close unions harm health? Asks a reader who likes clean graphs. The answer is an armchair, not a podium. Islanders were already small genetic neighborhoods, even when marriages were wide. Shipborne infections later rewrote ledgers with a ferocity that had nothing to do with cousins. Missionary diaries counted coughs like votes. Chants remembered long lives with a generosity that confuses statisticians. Excavation offers a few bones that whisper stress and then shrug because sample sizes are yawns, not trumpets. Some infants did not thrive, but infants in many centuries did not thrive for many reasons that like to travel together. Fever, famine, the fact that milk has its own mood. There were also robust LEI born of very tight lines who lived long, orchestrated lives and made bats behave. The fairest sentence is a sleepy one. Risk existed, outcomes varied. Causes braided together like a lei, you cannot reduce to one flower without being rude to the rest. Legend, as usual, sharpened pencils after the fact. One tale insists sacred matches made wonder children with double mana, as if you could add a second spoon at the last minute for courage. Another insists the gods punished such neat geometry with frailty, which says more about the storyteller's afternoon than the couple. The record, such as it is, prefers quilts to equations. Some patches shine. Some simply do their job. Quilts keep people warm better than charts, and that may be why families remember voices and laughs more accurately than they remember the width of degrees between cousins. The scene changes in the polite way scenes do when the tide decides to adjust the beach. Western visitors brought clocks, paper, and a marriage code that did not include voltage management by bloodline. Vows became law. Law became weather. Weather has a way of asking whole houses to redecorate. The public breaking of the Capu system fits neatly on a timeline, which is satisfying on chalkboards and misleading in rooms. In rooms, habits folded themselves away slowly, like cloaks put to rest cedar side up. Sibling unions at the very top dimmed because the stage had moved, and the script expected different exits. A queen who would have tightened the circle a generation earlier might now consider a man whose authority came from letters with seals and a handwriting that sailed to other courts. The cloak learned to glow behind glass. The frustration some houses asked of visitors' insulation, not humiliation, faded into captions. The new vocabulary included a hard word, INBRED, a tool useful to people who wish to measure or diminish a kingdom. A lens that could clarify or distort depending on the angle of the sun. The soft countermeasure is always the same. Context, which works best when you hold it so lightly you forget it is in your hand. Even with new rules, old light found new lamps. Genealogies moved from rafters to margins of Bibles and learned to be read by candlelight before services. The sense that a person could raise the temperature of a room by standing in it did not vanish. It learned to accompany jackets. In kitchens, the legacy kept its indoor voice. Aunties still assign jawlines to canoes. Uncles still locate a laugh on the left side of a long family. Children learn that the word for cousin is both more precise and more generous than a form will allow. Outsiders argue about crowns. Insiders discuss who should fold the kapa because patience runs in certain lines like a song. A few small, unnecessary, and therefore memorable facts belong here. A steward once insisted the awal bowl must be turned so the carved ridge faced east, a habit he could not prove but would not abandon. And the drink did taste more official that way. A chanter with a reliable baritone refused to recite a certain genealogy unless the surf had settled to a particular pattern. When he caught a cold, announcements waited, as if even politics needed the right tide. A breadfruit tree that always leaned toward the chiefess's door became part of the family because trees and people share habits. Later, a junior relative planted a cutting by a new house and waited patiently for it to tilt at the correct angle. None of this changes an empire. All of it changes a day. The quieter consequences are often the truer ones. With the end of sacred unions at the very top, alliance maps redrew themselves around schools, pens, and parliaments. The continuity that once moved by blood, moved by law and paper, and the ability to speak two vocabularies at once. Feathercloaks stopped counting battles and started counting visitors who leaned a little too close to glass. They still flashed like private sunrises. Rank went on breathing, though more discreetly. The word scandal faded or shifted its appetite. Where once a sibling match could raise eyebrows and lower voices, now a royal's choice to marry for fondness rather than treaty made a different set of columns and a different set of ledgers. It is all very calm on the page, which is exactly how the page likes it. If you zoom back to the women themselves, you can hear the stitching through all of it. A chiefess became a queen, and then a woman whose photograph lives in books. She still misplaced combs and laughed at herself, still preferred a particular salt on a particular fish. Because mornings listen better with salt, still knew which plank made. The small sigh in the rainy months, and which song calmed children faster than speeches calmed ministers. She kept a bowl with a handle repaired in Senate cord, because objects that have tried their best deserve encouragement. If you reduce her to the geometry of her marriage or the angle of her alliances, you miss the temperature of her breath when she stepped out at dawn and tasted the air to see which version of the island had arrived. By now, you can feel the 4 rooms of our walk have blurred pleasantly. The sacred logic of blood behaved like housekeeping. The scandals looked mostly like hinges. Health and myth braided into something usable and unprovable in equal measure. The fall of the system felt less like a collapse and more like a redecorating project with new carpenters and the same whims. The whole subject is quieter than it sounds. If you're still awake, imagine an evening house where the lamp that used to be a torch gives an honest circle of light, where a cloak rests cedar side up, where a mat lies flat because someone who loves corners made sure of it, where a chant thinks it is alone and keeps going anyway, and where a family tree outside negotiates with the breeze about whether to add 1 branch this year or simply hold steady and hum. If you're not awake, the mats and the cloaks and the breeze will keep the conversation at that same patient volume, which is exactly the kind of volume that teaches sleep how to be useful. You might not expect a key bolted to a factory wall to know what time it is, but for a long stretch of quiet nights, the key did exactly that, waiting like a small, practical oracle for a sleepy watchman to arrive and turn destiny by a quarter. Turn. In the age before motion sensors learned how to be smug, managers wanted proof that the person paid to walk around at 2 in the morning had actually walked around at 2 in the morning. So watchmen carried a heavy clock in a leather case, a metal stomach with a paper disc inside, and at each station he found a key chained to a hook. He inserted the key into the stomach, gave it a twist, and the clock left a bite mark at that minute, a polite wound that said, yes. The corridor existed, and so did I. This is not a thrilling arrangement, which is exactly why it works at bedtime. If you're still awake by the time we reach the night when the clocks jump backward, and the watchman gets paid for an hour that he lives through twice, you can subscribe as gently as you would close a ledger no flourish, just a soft thump that says nothing escaped. If you drift off sooner, the keys will keep telling time without you. Being ignored is their strongest skill. The first small detail is weight. A watch clock sits in the hand like a decision. Brass and steel and a glass window behave with the dignity of a pocket watch that's studied abroad and returned with opinions. A paper disc rides under the window, printed with a ring of hours and a bouquet of minutes, and a tiny stylus crouches nearby waiting to dent it. Each station key has teeth shaped so the clock will leave a mark in just the right sector of the disc. Different for each doorway and boiler room and stairwell, the way friends have different laughs. The watchman's route is a necklace of these. Keys, not glamorous, but if you listen closely, the chain makes a sound like patience practicing. Outside, the wind rehearses bending grass, and inside, the building hums softly about its own existence pipes settling their opinions, a belt shifting on a pulley, the unhurried arithmetic of the boiler. The watchman has a lantern and a pencil. Stub and the kind of coat that knows about 4 a.m. He also has a small book with rules nobody reads aloud. One of those rules says never set the clock down in a warm spot because paper likes to believe it is a wave in warm places. Another says never forget the spare disc. Modern analogies help here. It is like carrying your phone without any of the talents and all of the responsibility. If you've ever walked back home because you forgot your wallet, now imagine doing. At every hour, in circles, on purpose at the first station, the key is cold from the wall and a little spiteful. The watchman fits it into the clock, turns, and hears a click that is more satisfying than it has any right to be. The stylus bites and the disc accepts the truth of 1 a.m. The station's number will appear on the paper later like a tiny confession. He tucks the clock under his arm, checks a doorknob because he is paid to doubt doorknobs, and walks on. The second station lives near the loading dock, smelling faintly of rope, in an afternoon that was busier than it needed to be. The third is beside the stairwell, where a cat has clearly been employed to discourage mice and is clearing the hallway of ambition instead. The cat watches him pass with the expression of middle management. By the fourth station, he knows if the boiler is in the same mood it was in yesterday. By the fifth, he knows whether the night has chosen fog or stars. The system is not dramatic. That is the point. When your job is to notice everything, it helps if nothing happens. Sometimes a micro hook leaves its perch anyway. A door that should not be ajar is ajar by exactly the width of a watchman's suspicion. A puddle makes a shape that suggests the roof has been thinking. A window someone swore they latched earlier in the day has decided to enjoy letting the wind practice. The watchman makes notes in his pocketbook, and the night puts its own small check marks beside his. Quieter oddities keep him company. The station keys are shaped differently to avoid confusion in the clock, which means the wall hardware reads like an alphabet written by a locksmith. Some stations live outside in little metal houses you open like bird feeders, which is practical until winter, when the tiny lid freezes to the tiny house and the watchman is seen having a delicate discussion. With ice at 2:30, a few buildings put the station key behind a glass pane that says, "Break in emergency," which raises the intriguing question of whether routine is an emergency. There are even rumor keys, ghost stations that management threatens to install at awkward corners just to keep rounds lively. The gossip about these phantom hooks travels faster than most laundries. Every watchman has a story about a coworker who tried to take a nap and then stuffed the clock with cotton to fake the dents, which worked for 5 minutes until the paper disc came out looking like a sheep had tried timekeeping. There's also the rare watchman who adds extra rounds because doing so makes the night less empty. That person becomes a legend, and the manager frames the paper disc like a relic. Tiny dents marching around in a circle as if time were trying to knit. The second scene belongs to the paper itself because paper keeps track more tenderly than memory. At the end of a shift, the watchman opens the case, removes the disc as carefully as he would remove a coin he suspects is important, and signs his name where the form tells him to relax. The dents are small pupils staring back with perfect attention. 12:17 by the boiler, 1:03 at the dock, 1:41 near the lift, 2:05 because the cat demanded a chat. The supervisor will later slide this disc into a bound book full of other discs, and the book will underperform at parties but excel at solving arguments. Someone will say, "On Tuesday nothing happened," and the book will say, "On Tuesday, we went to the roof at 2:14 for reasons the cat knows." If a door was found open, the proof that it was closed again lives here, on a circle of paper that fit under a watchman's thumb all night. Bureaucracy is made of thousands of gestures. Like that, thumbs, circles, signatures that promise the future will remember the past accurately enough to be useful. It is mildly funny that the device is sometimes called a telltale, as if the clock were a shy witness that blushes and tells the truth only when pressed. Some models carry their paper discs on spindles, so the dents arrange into little spirals rather than rings. Looking at them is how you learn time has a body. There are practical tangents that deserve a drowsy minute. In some cities, a watchman had to carry a cane weighted at the bottom with lead, not to fight anyone, just to remind the cane who was in charge. In others, he wore a whistle to be used more often for boredom than alarm. A few factories tied there. Keys with chains so heavy they could measure a man's honesty. If he went too long without visiting, his shoulder told everyone. In a warehouse on a harbor, the keys rested a little from fog and put tiny orange fingerprints on the clock, which did not affect performance, but gave the paper discs a polite blush. A watchman learned the moods of doors and boilers and could tell whether a machine's cough was attention-seeking or the beginning of an opinion. He also learned where ghosts like to draft, because every building has one or two corners that keep last year's wind on retainer. This was all written nowhere and everywhere in the dents. The logbook at the end of the shift looked properly bored, and boredom is the polite name for safety. Now comes the night when time stumbles. Twice a year, the clock gets into an argument with itself, and the watchman becomes the referee nobody asked for. In the spring, he loses an hour in the middle like a sock in a dryer, and has to stitch the root together again so the dents do not get seasick. In the fall, he gains an hour he did not order. 2 o'clock arrives, performs, leaves, and then walks back in, saying cheerfully that it forgot its umbrella. The watchman shrugs and checks the dock again. The paper disc will contain 2 sets of dents for a single hour, and the supervisor will conclude that order has meaning even when it repeats. Payroll has thoughts. Morale has different thoughts. If you are still listening, this is the soft little punchline of the job. The person paid to prove time exists spends certain nights proving that time does not mind repeating itself as long as someone is polite enough to write it down twice. These are the hours when coffee counts as an instrument, not a beverage. The key at the 4th station is warmer now from being handled twice. It feels vaguely pleased with continuity. The 3rd section of the night belongs to weather. Cold slows. Everything except pipes that should have been tightened in August. Snow turns keys into lowercase exclamation marks. Rain teaches leather straps what humility feels like. The lantern does its quiet halo business, a mobile moon that agrees to visit only where invited. The watchman sees other people's lives. As if through a peephole, a light left on by a clerk who has promised to work only 15 more minutes and will therefore be gone by sunrise. A bundle of fabric on a table, arranged for tomorrow like a choreography that believes in the future. Once in a while, he writes a short letter to a supervisor, not because the policy requires it, but because the buildings seem to want it say. As when steam huffed from a seam in a manner that said, "I am pretending not to be dramatic." He learns that machines have bedtime stories. The generator prefers being told it did well. The elevator prefers being told nothing. The roof prefers being visited and glanced at, like a cat pretending to ignore company. All this goes into the watchman's posture and into the neat dents. On the paper, and though no form ever asks, the system somehow records the care dot. It is also the hour of small, absurd truths. A watchman will, at some point, drop a key. It will land underneath something that laughs at knees. He will spend 11 minutes meeting a floor he has avoided all winter. He will return the key to its hook and say, "There to no one in particular," which is the oldest prayer in the profession. A watchman will also carry crumbs. This is not snack negligence, it is emergency morale. Crumbs turn into minutes. Minutes turn into the top of the hour. The top of the hour turns into the sound of the stylus pressing an honest mark, and the honest mark turns into the permission to go on. He might hum a tune that has 2 notes and a contract with both of them. He might greet the plant's night birds by their nicknames, one feathered, one a piece of duct that always insists on talking. The paper disc cannot show these things. The paper disc can only imply them by being very calm. The 4th scene lets the legacy walk in, yawning. Watch clocks became swipe cards, and the keys on chains became plastic fobs that make elevators behave. The little bite marks on paper became timestamps in a database that nobody can find without a friendly intern. Guards now carry radios that know how to be dramatic politely, and cameras sit in corners making impartial faces. Yet, if you stand at certain doors late enough, you will see the old pattern. A person makes a round because buildings sleep better when someone checks their breathing. A person touches a point on the wall and waits for a beep that is simply the modern click. A person signs their name on a screen with a stylus that leaves no dent, and the system is improved in every measure except the one that counts the pleasure of seeing a paper circle filled with proof. Even the cat survives, narrower now, with a better contract. The watchman learns the new route and still pauses where the old stations were, because habit is also a form of architecture. He brings a phone instead of a lantern, and the phone keeps score of the stars. Whether or not he looks up dot, there is a rack of romance left in old equipment. Somewhere in a museum, a watch clock rests behind glass, heavy and improperly smug, its paper disc blank and expectant. You can imagine the same route a century ago, a man or a woman crossing the same quiet as you just crossed to the kitchen for. A glass of water. The building is honest. It has nothing to hide. It wants to be checked like a child asking, sleeping, yes. The click is the answer you hear in your own house when you try a door and find it locked in the way you intended. The past supplies a detail you did not ask for. The keys at certain stations were also door keys, a double duty that saved time, the way a sentence saves time by holding more verbs than grammar strictly allows. Managers learned to read discs, as if they were weather reports. A cluster of dents around one station meant the night had discovered a fascination. A sparse ring marked a flight gone easy. If a blank wedge appeared, someone would ask quietly whether feet had been found wanting or a cat had demanded more than its share of attention. We can wind down where the paper disc ends. The watchman returns to the little office where the kettle knows everything. He opens the case and lays out the proof like slices of a very dull cake. He signs and prints the time, which is already done, just making sure, and places the disc where morning will find it. He hangs the clock on its peg, and the peg receives it with the sound of wood that has agreed to this marriage. The building loosens its shoulders, if buildings have shoulders. The keys at the stations become decorations again. The lantern, or the phone, or the little flashlight with opinions takes a nap. If you are still awake, you can picture the night, detaching itself from the walls and folding into the pocket of the person who walked it. If you have drifted, the rounds will go on. A corridor will wait for footsteps, and footsteps will arrive, and a paper circle will learn its constellation of tiny bruises, and in the morning someone will nod and decide that nothing happened, which is the highest praise a night can ask for. You might not expect a room full of undelivered envelopes to sound like weather, But a dead letter office has a hush that drifts the way snow does, piling up without anyone deciding where. The paper has its own climate. It rustles in small fronts and settles in tidy drifts against shelves. Clerks move through it like slow clouds with pencils. There's a clock, of course, but the real time is counted in stacks, and the hour changes whenever a bundle finishes telling its story. I'll keep the tone gentle, the way a stamp sits in the corner and does its job without comment. If you're still awake by the time we reach the little drawer labeled Street Names Guessed Correctly, you can subscribe as softly as you would press a seal in warm wax study. No flourish, absolutely certain the impression will hold. If you float off before then, the letters will keep sorting themselves into tomorrow. They do that even when nobody's watching. The door opens to the mild drama of misdirection. Every letter here left home bravely and then lost its way at an intersection made of details. An absent house number, a town that changed its mind about a street, a smudged surname, a stamp whose corner decided to curl at the worst moment. The mail coach, then the railway bag, then a sorting clerk's hand tried to make sense. And at last the envelope arrived at a place where sense is the main trade. The sign on the wall says something practical like Returned Letters Branch, but everyone calls it the dead letter office, even though nothing in the room feels dead. Everything is simply undecided. Clerks begin with observation and end with paperwork, which is the standard human route. They weigh a letter in the palm the way a baker weighs dough. They check for a second address under the first, the way memory checks under the bad for the other shoe. Sometimes they hold it up to the light, a shy examination that resembles a prayer for clarity. There are rules about privacy and knives with blades, designed more for persuasion than for drama. Most letters are resealed and sent on their way with a small apology written in pencil that looks like a shrug. There is a rhythm to these rescues that would make a metronome proud. A bundle arrives tied with string older than it needs to be. A clerk unties and braids the usual promise, "We'll try." Handwriting is the first puzzle and the most forgiving. Some hands lean so far to the right they nearly lie down. Some make a parade of capitals that salute each time a word begins. A clerk learns to read the way a gardener learns to listen to soil. An M might really be N. An E might have thought about being F and then change back. Invisible ink doesn't show up very often. Invisible intentions do, and those are easier to fix. Paper carries small hints if you look. There's sand in the fold. Perhaps the sender lives near the shore. The envelope smells faintly of oranges, perhaps a packing house. A return address is sometimes hidden inside, as if trust needed a workshop. Clerks in earlier centuries were allowed to open letters only if the envelope resisted every other attempt at good manners. They did it quietly and with witnesses, because even envelopes appreciate having someone pay attention. Sometimes the solution is a map. A clerk traces the outline of a county with a fingertip and says, "In the voice people use for plants, I think you meant the other Springfield." The envelope forgives the sender, forgives the world, and joins a different bag as if it had always intended to. A dead letter office collects tiny absurdities the way a lint trap collects stray mornings. Items that were never meant to travel arrive carefully stamped and baffled. A single glove trying to visit its mate. A brass key hoping to be recognized by a lock it has never met. A pair of spectacles wrapped in a page torn from a cookbook that later gets filed under evidence of humanity. There are parcels that contain consequences. A cake now thinking philosophical thoughts about time. A packet of seeds that has decided to sprout despite the indignity of brown paper. A tin of sweet sincerely trying to ignore gravity's opinion. Clerks record each in a ledger that has the narrative ambition of a novel and the punctuation of a grocery list. Somewhere in the middle of a thick volume you will find, in tidy hand, one small stone, believed sentimental. The stone will wait patiently in a pigeonhole until the world remembers whose pocket it belonged to. Micro hook, once, an envelope addressed to the man with the red beard who sells good boots, reached exactly the right shop because a clerk knew both the boots and the beard. Offices like these thrive on the sterling practicality of gossip, can measure tenderness in the way an address is corrected. A clerk switches 2 letters in a surname as softly as a nurse straightening a blanket. Another notices the sender has written a second town name in the flourish of the Y, a habit that would never help except today, when it does. There are experiments. Certain inks disappear when held near a flame. Certain pencil marks return. Under the breath of a teapot, someone tries both, and a faint apartment number surfaces like a fish reconsidering privacy. Not every method is elegant. A few eras relied on letter readers, people with a knack for decoding strangers' handwriting. Their job title sounded romantic for about 5 minutes, and then turned into a headache with a pencil. Still, there's pleasure in watching them work. They hold the envelope at a slant and narrow their eyes as if the address might confess. Sometimes it does. An R stands up and admits to being a BA7, puts on a tie, and becomes an LA smudge. When encouraged, becomes a comma and points to a house at the end of a lane you were about to skip. What cannot be saved is cataloged. The bundle of permanently lost addresses is smaller than you'd fear and larger than anyone wants. Historically, certain offices kept museums of objects that resisted delivery wedding veils that decided to become history. Walking sticks that found themselves among cousins, a beehive sent as a gift and politely returned to nature, letters addressed to emperors who had resigned the position and were trying to enjoy retirement. Some countries held auctions, and a local paper reported them with the same tone it used for rainfall totals. People came to bid on the mystery of a sealed box. They went home with a hairbrush and a story. There's something funny and kind in the way undelivered gifts find new homes, like dogs who skip their assigned family and end up with exactly the right person anyway. A clerk once admitted that the objects he most enjoyed rescuing were umbrellas, because umbrellas belong immediately. Wherever it rains, the second scene belongs to the ledgers, which sleep like whales on a long shelf and surface when needed. A ledger is not exciting in the usual sense. It is exciting the way steady breathing is. Each column holds a promise: date, origin, attempted destination, action taken, result. The check marks look modest until you understand what they are saying, which is, we paid attention long enough. In the 19th century, it was common to paste slips of envelopes into books, a paper quilt of errors and their corrections. A row of slips, each with a pencil note, forwarded to the newer number, name inquired at the post delivered to aunt. No such street, likely meant north, tells the story of a city teaching itself to be findable. The ledger is also a diary. It knows when a young clerk first learned the code for the suburb with 2 names. It knows when a veteran finally retired and took his stubby pencil with him on principle. It knows that on a rainy Thursday, a bundle addressed only to Santa was given its own process that did not fit cleanly in any column. The office ran on rules, but it kept a shelf reserved for kindness. You cannot spend long in a dead letter office without noticing the small mercy of the resealing table. A clerk warms the gum on an envelope with steam that makes its own cloud weather. The flap rejoins the address as if the whole episode had been a short dream. A stamp reinstates dignity. A hand cancels the stamp with a neat circle and a date, a little time anchor for the journey. Old offices used sealing wax for certain corrections, and the wax sat in sticks like crayons for adults. The impression in the wax looked like authority. It is really caretaking. Occasionally, an open letter contained money because someone believed in paper more than banks. The rules were strict: record, receipt, reseal, attempt delivery again, and if all else failed, hold the money separately for a time measured in patient months before it trickled into the fund that kept the system honest. It is mildly comic that coins have a better sense of address than notes. Coins cannot be encouraged to lie flat and pretend to be stationary. Third scene, and the geography changes, even if the work doesn't. Telegraph offices had their own version of undeliverable messages, a telegram written to a man who left town that morning, a sympathy wire that arrived a day after the funeral, a jubilant birth announcement that discovered it was walking behind the news. Operators tried forwarding, tried hand delivery, tried the bar next door, which often knew more than the directory. The line between telegraph and post was blurrier than we think. Clerks borrowed each other's stubbornness. In some towns afoot, messenger could cross the street from the telegraph counter to the dead, letter window, and solve 3 problems with 1 pair of legs. Later, telephone switchboards inherited the habit of chasing names through air instead of paper. And still later, email servers built dead letter queues where messages go. When the address feels wrong in that electrical way computers express doubt, the modern message never touches a table. It waits in a log nobody reads until a patient administrator performs the same old rescue. Check the spelling, try the other address, forward, document, breathe. Back in the room with actual paper, the day rolls like a cart with good wheels. Letters about ordinary things make up the bulk. Receipts, advice, invitations that assume a future. A few pages are embroidered at the edges with flourishes so lush the address gets lost in its own garden. A clerk trims with his eyes only, never. The knife. He finds the plain name in the center and prefers it. There are letters to God, addressed with confidence and no stamp. Offices handle these according to local custom, which is another way of saying kindly. Some are forwarded to clergy who answer with gentle sentences that never ask for a return. Postage. Some are filed under neither dead nor deliverable. Exactly. The room is practical about feelings. A clerk who reads a sentence not intended for him learns to blink the knowledge away and keep only the useful parts, the street, the town, the hope that the correct door will open. A microtangent loves the tools. Magnifying lenses with handles, like tiny scepters, tweezers for coaxing out slips that hid in folds, a pencil that believes in erasing more than writing, a set of guidebooks to town names that change their minds. There is a rack for strings, a shamefully interesting cupboard of adhesives, and a drawer of small weights for persuading curled paper to reconsider. The clock on the wall prefers the rhythm of stacks rather than seconds. When a bundle is untied, an hour changes. When a shelf is cleared, a week passes. At noon, someone rings a bell that has no legal function and yet keeps the universe in order. Lunch smells like coffee and labels. The 4th scene belongs to endings that aren't really endings. The old dead letter offices have mostly turned into mail recovery centers with scanners, databases, and a confidence in barcodes that borders on poetry. A machine can read the faintest ghosts of ink. A clerk, now called a specialist, can see an address where even theory had given up. Parcels still turn up with their own jokes. One arrived addressed to the person who knows, and it found an expert anyway. Phones join the investigation. The database shows a change of address filed 2 weeks ago. The package reroutes as if it were following breadcrumbs. The humor remains dry. When computers handle a bundle perfectly, they print a label that says, so in capital letters because computers love capital letters. When computers make a mess, humans step around them with the patience of people who work with gravity professionally. Digital life copied the problem and the solution with very little editing. Email servers hold undeliverable messages in queues with names like retry and dead. An administrator opens a log at 3 in the morning and performs the same. Small kindness, correct a letter, nudge a route, explain to a machine that the town it insists is wrong is in fact precisely where the message wants to go. The only thing missing is the smell of paper, which the brain provides anyway if you've ever lived near a shelf. Even texts have their version, hovering on phones that change numbers, little bubbles of intent waiting for new roads. Somewhere, a person finds an old account and opens it to discover messages stacked like postcards in a drawer, ordinary, late, undramatic, and therefore perfect. The modern dead letter office is invisible, but its lullaby hasn't changed. We tried again. We will try again in 5 minutes. We will keep trying until the clock and the system agree that effort has been seen. If you're still awake, it helps to imagine one letter all the way through. The envelope is cream, a little thick, the kind sold in packets that want to believe they improve your handwriting. The sender miswrote the number, or perhaps the street grew a new suffix overnight. The letter rides in a bag with others, sits in a sorting bin, attempts the wrong door politely, and then returns to the office that specializes in second chances. A clerk studies the name and remembers a directory change 2 months ago when a lane became a road and everyone grew briefly taller. He adjusts the line with a pencil that was not expensive and therefore does not fear work. He reseals the flap with a breath of steam. He applies a label the color of pale authority. The letter leaves again with the determination of a quiet runner. 2 days later, it arrives, and someone opens it while standing at a kitchen counter. The someone reads a paragraph that would have been useful last week and is still useful today. Because friendship, like the post, is patient with delays. That moment is the point of the whole room of paper and ledgers and kind pencils. The system exists so that a day can be improved late and still count. And if you have put the story down inside your head and left the room gently, the clerks will go on. They will find the person who moved across town and forgot that mail follows if asked nicely. They will guess the correct apartment number because the envelope knows the elevator brand. They will sort letters to Santa into a process that understands the importance of answering dreams with careful sentences. They will keep a drawer labeled possibles for things that might yet confess their cities. At closing time, the string is tied around tomorrow's bundles, and the ledgers close with a soft sound that suggests competence. The last clerk checks the window and turns the sign to the evening. Somewhere a street lamp clicks on, and somewhere a dog decides to bark as if it invented the idea. The paper settles like weather. In the morning, there will be new misdirections to fix, new tiny miracles to underplay, and a fresh pencil with a point that believes in addresses. The room will fill again with rustling, patient drift, and the only drama will be whether today's coffee is the good kind, which, in an office that specializes in finding what's missing, it usually is. You might not expect a rectangle to have a personality, but paper sizes do, and they show it in the way they agree to be halved without starting an argument. Some sheets are boring knowing that when you fold them, the halves will look like the parrot looked yesterday, just smaller and somehow pleased. Others were measured by tradition and a good eye and the width of a craftsman's thumb on a very steady day. The good news is none of this matters at any urgent volume. We can stroll. If you're still awake by the time I wander into the quiet rivalry between the 2-hole punch and the 3-hole punch, feel free to subscribe as lightly as you press a crease with the back of a spoon. If sleep arrives first, the sheets will keep their edges by themselves. They have been practicing since pulp remembered to be patient. The first detail that likes to be noticed is a ratio that behaves like a calm trick. The A series of paper, the one that gives the world a 4 letters and a 3 drawings and a 5 notebooks that fit in bags like polite guests, is built on the square root 2 ratio. It means that when an A0 sheet is cut in half along its longer side, the 2 A1s that appear keep the same shape. This continues without drama. A 2, a 3, a 4, each a younger cousin with the same facial expression. AO is exactly 1 square meter in area, which is the kind of fact that likes to sit in the corner and know things. Germany standardized it first. In the early 20th century, when rooms everywhere were discovering that tidy measurements make filing less theatrical, the pleasure is not in the numbers, but in how they behave. Fold in a 4 and you get in a 5 that looks as if it just put on. A coat. Stack 2A5 south and the pile returns to a 4 like a thought remembering itself. Somewhere a designer used that ratio to make a pamphlet fit human hands without asking the hands to try harder. The modern eye treats this as obvious, which is the highest. Compliment we can pay a standard. Across the ocean, a different rectangle kept its own counsel. The American letter size, 8.5 by 11 inches, arrived through a series of habits that learned to stand still. Early mills cut huge sheets with names like cap, demi, and double post, and clerks folded them to fit desks, drawers, and expectations. 1/2 of a 1722 sheet is satisfyingly 8.5 times 11, and the tradition settled there with the relief of a chair that doesn't wobble. It's not a ratio that reproduces itself under folding like the square root 2 family. It's a compromise that survived because offices are sentimental about drawers. Legal size at 14 inches long seems to have been invented by paper that wanted to stretch before it sat down. Fool's cap, once 13.5 inches long, walked off into folklore with a cap on. If you line them up on a table A4 at 210,297 millimeters beside 8.5 times 11 inches, the difference is a whisper. One fits a European ring binder with the elegance of a key finding its lock. The other pleases certain photocopiers the way a favorite mug pleases a morning. Neither is wrong. Both are rectangles that have learned how to work for a living, standards like company, and they collect friends with holes. Before a binder can pretend to be a book, a sheet needs to agree to be perforated, and the history of hole punching is just more furniture for the quiet museum of office life. In the late 19th century, clever Germans patented devices that asked paper to notice cylinders, a lever, a die, a crisp circle surrendered to a tiny confetti storm. Friedrich Sonecken sold a punch and a ring binder that courted each other in public. Lights refined the romance. By the time the 20th century began clearing its throat, desks everywhere knew the sound a punch makes when it declares a sheet. Committed. The European 2-hole standard places the centers 80 millimeters apart, as if the page were wearing a pair of sensible spectacles. 4-hole systems repeat that spacing for extra poise. Americans, cheerful contrarians, preferred 3 holes. Outer centers 4.25 inches apart, the middle one centered like a very calm belly button, the hole diameter typically a whisker under. 1/3 of an inch. None of these measurements need to be memorized to fall asleep. It's enough to know that holes have feelings about symmetry and shelves. Appreciate predictability. Folders and binders are the furniture that paper trusts. Manila folders, called Manila, not because they hold tickets to a tropical vacation, but because they once relied on fibers that traveled from there, stand in drawers like polite citizens waiting for a turn. Hanging folders add a bit of metal along the top, so they can glide in rails and make the pleasing sound that organization makes when it believes in itself. 3-ring binders creak in a voice that says school is possible. European lever arch. Files have a large metal clip that bites down like a crocodile that took a course in manners. The little steel tongue, called a compressor bar, presses a stack so it forgets to be unruly. Somewhere a clerk pushes the lever and the rings open with a tidy clack that feels like a day agreeing to proceed. None of this is dramatic. That is exactly why your breathing slows while we talk about it. Printers, which are small houses for impatience, learn the sizes like everyone else. A 4M letter requires slightly different conversations with rulers. The margins nod accordingly. Photocopiers have their own etiquette for ever asking a 4 in a cheerful tone, even when a letter-sized document has paid admission. The person standing there touches a button labeled, "No, honestly, letter," and the machine accepts the correction the way a cat accepts a change of plans, graciously and with an implied note. Fax machines, when they were confident, preferred thermally reactive paper rolled into curls that remembered being cylinders. Later, they accepted plain sheets and forgot they were special. We crease down a folded letter that traveled in a standard envelope behaves like a memory palace. Unfold it, and the paper remembers where it spent the night. Some stationary objects carry biographies in their hardware. The humble 3-hole punch has an adjustable guide that slides with the seriousness of a sextant. Under the base lies a trapdoor where confetti waits to be congratulated on its freedom. The drawer fills astonishingly, as if paper, like bread, expands when perforated. Emptying it becomes a weather event. A snow of circles kisses the trash bin, and a few escapees decorate the carpet so future historians can estimate how often reports were stapled near this chair. Staplers, for their part, have settings that flip the legs of the staple inward for permanence or outward for temporary alliances. Small diplomacy that most of us choose by accident. Binder clips were patented in 1910 and have all the charisma of a black triangle that learned empathy. They hold a stack without puncture and then retire with the grace of an actor who knows when to leave the stage. None of this makes headlines, and yet a billion pages have stayed in order because these tools never asked to be seen. There is a paper size named. That is the exact area of 1 square meter, and sometimes a print shop unfurls one on a counter. Like a mild banner. Architects and engineers have whispered to sheets that large, their pencils practicing the grammar of buildings. Then the sheet is cut and folded until it becomes a drawing somebody can carry up a stair. Somewhere else a pack of A6 postcards sits ready to behave like little announcements. ISO sizes are like nesting dolls that learn calculus. You could spend an afternoon folding and never reach confusion, only smaller versions of the same calm. Shape. This is less a history than a lullaby sung by a ruler. The metaphor you're looking for is probably a family that knows how to sit for a photograph. Tall in the back, small in the front, everyone still looking like themselves. Margins were negotiated, and the negotiations had manners. Typewriters needed room on the left for binding or for correcting with eraser shields that looked like tiny masks. Word processors inherited those spaces as defaults that seldom argued. In many offices, the right margin enjoyed being ragged because honesty looks like that on a weekday. In others, justification asked the words to line up at both edges like soldiers with good posture. The choice says more about personality than about virtue. On a 4, the official margins often measured in centimeters. On letter, they were generous in inches, which is why the same document sometimes looks as if it is wearing different jackets, depending on where it flies. A small sleepy joke hides here. You can tell where a report grew up by how it breathes near the edges. Meanwhile, envelopes trained to be gracious. DL envelopes accept a 4 folded in thirds with a sigh of recognition. Monarch envelopes in the U.S. prefer letter folded in a way that pleases pens with nibs. Window envelopes are the little periscopes of bureaucracy. They save a clerk from copying an address and reward printers for learning to aim. Padded mailers contain compromise and bubble wrap anxiety in equal measure. Labels learn to peel. Tabs learn to be ignored until they weren't. It is all a long conversation between glue and patience. The whole time, the rectangles say nothing and cooperate. The sleepy argument between 2-hole and 3-hole advocates keeps all this from becoming too smooth. 2 holes make it easy to flip a page like a book. 3 holes keep edges flatter in a binder on the move. 4 holes offer a belt and suspenders. Solution beloved by people who talk to their filing cabinets. Adapters exist. Small strips of punched card that let a sheet drilled one way live happily in a binder drilled another. It is a tiny version of international relations. A peacemaker with a stapler in their pocket walks in, suggests comb binding for everyone, and then remembers that comb binding does not like to lie flat on a photocopier, and we all go back to our holes with a renewed appreciation of pluralism. History, being generous, offers a prequel called Parchment and a sequel called Pixels. Scribes wrote on skins carefully scraped and stretched until they behaved like obedient cloud. That material preferred to be folded into gatherings called choirs, which is a word that sounds like a choir and behaves like one. Later, rag paper learned to be made in vats where water and fiber agreed to pretend they had always been friends. Watermarks began as born with tattoos for sheets that wanted to wave at sunlight. Only then, after centuries of temperature and patience, did office paper arrive on our desks and ask to be punched in a consistent location so it could join a binder. Now, documents come packaged in files that count their own pages and can be copied infinitely without paper's warm friction. And yet, even the most paperless system uses the old metaphors. We still say pages, margins, folders, tabs. We still press print to PDF, which is a very elegant way of admitting that rectangles built our sense of order. A tiny myth wanders through this museum, the story that an empire's railroad gauge descends from the width of Roman chariots. It's a satisfying line that explains standardization with horses. It's also more folklore than ledger entry. The truer point is that standards survive when they let things talk to each other without shouting. ISO sizes make printers and envelopes nod from different countries. Letter size lets a million file drawers say, "Welcome," without needing translation. If you hand in a 4 sheet to a used 3-hole punch, it will sulk a little and then do the job. If you hand a letter sheet to a 2-hole European punch, it will behave politely and ask you not to turn too quickly. These little inconveniences are not problems. They are how objects maintain their accents, which helps us remember where we are. We can visit a school corridor now, not to hurry, but to watch pages behave. A binder rides under an elbow, its rings honest about their squeak. A subject divider with a colored tab keeps a semester from thinking it is a week. Loose leaf paper flirts with the idea of being truly loose and then backs down because math class will be easier if the whole reinforcements stick. In a library, a staff member adjusts the blade on a guillotine cutter with the reverence of someone tuning a cello. The cutter makes a clean sigh through a stack and yields, a promise of straightness that readers will not notice and will nevertheless appreciate. In an office, someone empties the confetti drawer of a hole punch and realizes, not for the first time, that the past month can be weighed in circles. The small absurdities are where drowsiness gathers. A sheet will always stick to its neighbor because paper has opinions about humidity. A jam in a printer will always hide a corner so well that a poet could write about it. 3-ring binders on a shelf imitate the spines of novels so successfully that you can tell which departments are extroverts by whether they label those spines by hand or with a label maker that believes in crispness. Someone will forever argue that stapling at a 45-degree angle is better because the staple legs land in different neighborhoods of the margin and avoid the holes later. Someone else will claim the exact opposite with charts. Both of them are. Right, and both of them are asleep by the time the charts finish being accurate. What remains after all this agreement is the sound of a page turning in good light. The sheet lifts, travels, settles, and the binder rings hold without needing thanks. If for or a letter, 2 holes or 3, the rectangle did its job. It gave lines, and graphs and everyday sentences a quiet shape to inhabit. The next person can find the thing they need because some standards committee in 1922 and some mill hand in 1890, and some clerk with a steady pencil yesterday, all kept choosing neatness over novelty. If you are still awake, imagine a drawer, closing with the soft bump that says the folders are aligned. If you are drifting, imagine nothing at all. Rectangles thrive without witnesses. Either way, the paper waits with the patience of a horizon. Tomorrow you will open the binder, and the ring will answer with a small click that means yes, the shape is still a shape, and there's room for one more page if you need it. You might not expect a city to have a bedtime story, but for a long while, the story began with a man and a pole and a tiny flame that behaved like a polite rumor. At dusk, he walked a route that had been measured in footsteps before it was ever measured in yards. The pole was taller than he was, with a hook for the stopcock and a small wick at the end cradled in a metal cup. The cup burned a tremor of flame fed by a bottle of oil that smelled like a lecture on patience. He tipped the flame into the glass shade of the first street lamp, turned the cock with the hook until the quiet hiss sounded confident, and the mantle brightened from cloth to ghost to usable light. Then he walked on, coat flapping like a page. The lamps woke up one by one, and the street learned how to be evening. I'll keep this slow, the way a flame lengthens when wind forgets to meddle. If you're still awake by the time we oil the snuffer and count a row of chimneys that insist on being cleaned even on Thursdays, you can subscribe as softly as a match being coaxed, without drama. If you drift off first, the lights will go on without you. They have always preferred to do their work when no one is trying to be impressed. The first small detail is that lamplighting is a schedule disguised as a walk. A route sheet folded in a pocket tells the order of lamps, though the lamplighter could trace it with eyes closed after a month. The city is divided into beats the way a poem is divided into lines, irregular but strangely memorable. Each lamp has a number painted discreetly on the post or etched into a bracket. The numbers are not consecutive because streets never keep their promises. The man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a boy apprenticed early to the art of not hurrying starts near a depot where mantles are kept like folded snow. Mantles are delicate bags of woven fabric that look like nothing until they meet a flame and transform into a shell of oxides that glows when gas touches it. It's a chemistry lecture that forgot to raise its voice. He carries spare mantles in a pocket tin with tissue, a wick trimmer, a bottle, and a rag that has known more soot than conversation. In older districts, the lamps are still of the pre-mantle type, their naked flames soft as sighs. In newer places, the mantle insists on being brighter, a modest vanity that the city forgives because people like seeing their feet. Nothing is urgent. The lamplighter's pace is the unit of measure. He reaches the first corner and makes a small ceremony of opening the glass door. The hinges complain with a noise that knows both rain and gratitude. A quick puff through pursed lips persuades. Last night's ash to remember is finished. If the glass chimney is fogged, the rag makes a circle inside that brings back clarity and a faint smell of yesterday. He lifts the pole, feels for the stopcock the way a piano tuner feels for a note, turns, and the mantle flowers. It is not dramatic, it is right. At this corner, a grocer's sign swings gently. At the next, a gate that never learned modesty squeals. At the third, someone's upstairs curtain flutters because people forget the city has its own habits. In some towns, he lights every other lamp and the night makes dotted lines. In others, he lights them all, and the streets become sentences with too many commas, and nobody minds dot at intervals. A strange microfact wanders out and makes itself known. In winter, the pole must be warmed by a glove, or the metal answers with a sting. A rulebook says the lamplighter must not carry more than one mantle between thumb and forefinger at a time, because mantles resent being crowded before their audition. Another page says not to light a lamp with a newspaper spill, because newsprint flakes and makes the chimney sulk. Supervisors with ledgers judge routes by the minute, and then concede that minutes behave differently when wind decides to have a personality. Some villages never adopted mantles at all, but clung to little fishtail burners that burn like commas. The lamplighter adjusts his hand because commas and mantles prefer different coaxing. And there is always a cat that attends the rounds like a manager and refuses to sign anything. The second scene is a workshop that happens to be a street. The lamplighter is also the lamp's doctor. If a mantle tears, he pinches the gas, lets the last glow travel into dark, loosens the little wire, and replaces the fragile bag with fingers that learned humility from chess. The new mantle looks earthy and unimpressive. He lights it once without gas to burn off the cotton, and the mantle shrinks into a brittle ghost. Then the gas, then the bloom, and the ghost becomes a lighthouse for moths that arrive muttering about destiny. A snuffer hangs from the belt to extinguish a flame when the hour asks. The snuffer is shaped like a tiny bell that whispers, "Enough." In copper, the pole ends in a shepherd's crib that can lift a glass door without arguing. In higher neighborhoods, there are lamps mounted to ornate brackets that persuade the lamplighter to carry a short ladder. Ladders in this profession have ears for cobbles, and learn which stones disappoint them lest rain complicates the numbers but not the mood. Rain likes to sit on glass. It blurs the world until the lamplighter chooses a circle to clear and the world agrees to be a circle. Gas pressure from the mains is a minor character with strong feelings. Too low and the mantles glow like thoughtful tea. Too high and the flame noses the mantle with impudence. Somewhere, not visible from the root, a man at the works adjusts a valve, and in 5 minutes a district brightens as if the city inhaled. On certain holidays, the order comes from the depot to augment the rounds with colored lantern shades, because humans like their rituals to be seen by their own reflections. On solemn nights, the order says to leave a few lamps dark in mourning, and the darkness makes a shape that people understand without learning it first. Records exist because cities are made of paper under the gas. A supervisor's book lists each lamp with a column for cleaned, another for mantle replaced, and a third for cobra noted, which is a joke in a town without cobras but with a taste for dramatic shorthand. Cobras, in these books, are spiders who learn to decorate mantles with a single strategic thread that collapses an evening's plan. The lamplighter draws a tiny X when a household stops him to report a lamp that whistles. Lamps sometimes whistle. They are pipes thinking. They are birds. The book also holds receipts for broken chimneys, signed by people who insist the wind broke them personally. At the end of the month, there is a census of glass, soot, and walks that were longer than they needed to be. None of it rises above the hum of the mantle. The humming is not audible to most. It is the other kind of hum, the sense of correctness. Deciding to stay a while, a small story drifts in about clocks. Before electricity taught cities to argue with midnight by committee, the lamplighter's watch told the truth even to people who did not know its language. Dusk came earlier in December. Dawn entered later in January. The route expanded and contracted like a sleeve. In some places, the lamplighter was also the town's caller, announcing the hour with a staff on the cobbles, which sounds like drama but is really a tradition's way of telling the night that someone was awake and the chimneys were being fraternized with in an official capacity. Daylight saving arrived later and caused an evening of confusion during which everyone agreed to pretend that an hour could be both present and absent if the lamp said so. And afterward, it was never mentioned again because gas doesn't care. For debate stop third, we drift to the older skill inside the job, cleaning. Light loves clean glass the way fish love complete water. Sit discovers the inside of chimneys with the passion of a tourist and immediately takes photographs. The lamplighter erases the photographs patiently. Circular motions with the rag. A quick check for cracks. A moment spent convincing the hinge to remain a morally upright hinge. Some lamps have reflectors, curved tins that aim light downward like a suggestion, and those demand a wipe with a cloth that knows how to talk to shine. There is an old apprentice trick of breathing gently on glass before polishing the moisture, allowing the cloth to make decisions without streaks. The glass is not grateful, but it behaves. Under the glass, insects have written their own literature and must be evicted with diplomacy. Moths apologize. Beetles pretend to understand. A quick microhook that arrives with boots. A lamplighter's solas are cut to read cobbles. The city communicates through the feet slopes that become slippery, ironwork that is sulky when wet, curbs that collect hints about who passed and whether they carried a loaf or an opinion. In some towns, the lamplighter is issued nails for his boots in winter, and the sound of those nails on the night pavement becomes the neighborhood's reassurance. Dogs learn to ignore it. Babies let the rhythm decide they have permission to sleep longer. A few houses peg their dinner time to the first lamp before their gate lighting. If the lamplighter is ill and a substitute comes with a different stride, stew burns and nobody blames anyone because the city is a coordination exercise conducted with cutlery. Another absurdity, the lamplighter is part locksmith. Vandalized stopcocks require a small spanner. Broken latches, a strip of tin, and 2 screws made from patience. A wind-shaken post occasionally needs guy wire. The lamplighter grapples with it under starlight, turns the screw late enough that no one notices, and the post stands straighter as if practicing decorum for daylight. Children leave notes on some posts asking the lamplighter to please light. Early because we are playing dragons. If the rulebook is in a relaxed mood, he does. If not, the note flutters like a flag declaring that bureaucracy is paying attention and will, in time, approve dragons. The 4th scene is the polite retirement of the craft, which refused to be tragic and therefore became charming. Electricity arrived like a cousin with better tools. Filaments glowed without mantles. Switches learned how to be punctual without feet. Whole districts converted over the course of months, and lamplighters found themselves reassigned as inspectors of lamps that no longer required fire. Some towns kept gas lamps in ceremonial streets because everyone agreed the old light made faces kinder and corners less sure of themselves. There are photographs of lamplighters shaking hands with posts before leaving them to electricity, which may be staged and may also be true in the way staged things sometimes are. The last lamplighters worked pockets of stubborn glow into the 20th century parks, alleys, and neighborhoods that liked the sound of a pole finding a latch. Museums collected their poles and snuffers and tins of mantles. Guide signs call the tools accoutrements, a word with more syllables than soot. In London and Prague and Berlin and a dozen other cities, you can still see men in dark coats lighting lamps at festivals, their pace the exact tempo required to make an evening begin politely. In some parks, the lamps are clockwork, a mechanism. Inside opens and closes a valve at predestined hours, and the lamplighter's job is to wind them once a week. Winding a park is a hobby that cities wish they had time for. The legacy is everywhere when you look sideways. Electric streetlights still follow roads, still demand cleaning, still prefer clear glass. A once-a-year cherry picker fulfills the rag's old vow at an altitude the lamplighter avoided on principle. Engineers measure lumens with a fervor once reserved for mantles. Control rooms dim groups of lamps for nocturnal animals or brighten them for parades. A remote choreography that preserves the lamplighter's old power to decide where evening is thick and where it is thin. Even our vocabulary remembers. We still say lights out as if a person would come to oblige. We still picture a city lighting up as a sequence, rather than as millions of switches sulking in parallel. The romance we assign to gaslight in novels is mostly borrowed from the certainty that someone walked out at dusk just to keep the dark honest. One more detail, because drowsiness likes extras, lampposts in certain districts had tiny brass tags. Stamped with the lamplighter's initials for the year a new mantle was first installed. The tags remain, tarnished stars low on the iron, the way trees keep old scars near the base where children pretended to be sailors. In winter, breath made halos around the lamplighter's mustache. In summer, midges fussed and then forgot what they were fussing about. He wore a cap that had learned to resist drizzle. He knew which grocery offered him an apple at the alley and which offered nothing but a nod. Both kinds of generosity being useful in their way. The instruments of his trade weighed less than certainty. If you are still awake, imagine one route. Without design. He turns off the depot's light, locks the door, and steps into the hour the sky needs to decide itself. The first lamp asks politely to be condensed. He does the small sequence of motions that have turned evening into evening every day for years. The mantle brightens to the color of people telling each other how their day went. A bus rumbles like an older cousin. The lamplighter walks to the next corner. A child watches from a window and believes he controls night. A dog regards the pole as a statement about geometry. A moth tries a career pivot and glows, lovelier than it expected. He tips the snuffer on one lamp to fix a hiss, wipes a reflector to persuade shadows to sit up straighter, writes a note in a pencil that knows how to work with cold fingers. He reaches the last lamp near the river, and the water replies with its own set of versions of light, each one convincing, none in competition. And if you drifted off somewhere on the 2nd or 3rd Street, the route continues on your behalf. The paper in the supervisor's drawer collects a neat set of ticks. The city center becomes readable in increments. Steps and poles and mantles organize the ordinary. Later, much later, a mechanic presses a switch in a building that hums, and lamps wink to life all at once without needing a person's stride to divide them. Still, there is a memory in the infrastructure, a small courtesy built into the circuits that says, if you like, we can pretend this is still a walk. The lights agree by coming on, not with thunder, but with the soft certainty of someone who has already counted the chimneys and found them adequate. And somewhere a cat keeps the schedule for its own reasons. And a gate squeals because squealing is what gates do at dusk, and the city exhales as if a story were about to be told, and you were already floating toward the part where the snuffer says goodnight.